The topic of Lecture 6 is text coherence. Coherence represents one of the central categories of the text. In linguistic literature, coherence is defined as connectivity of underlying meaning of a text, while cohesion is the connectivity of its surface structure. Hence, both cohesion and coherence are text-centered notions designating the integrity of its form and content. Bokrand and Dressler define coherence as a continuity of senses. It concerns the ways in which the components of the textual world, that is, the configuration of concepts and relations which underlie the surface text, are mutually accessible and relevant. A concept is definable as a cognitive content which can be recovered or activated in the mind. Relations are the links between concepts which appear together in a textual world, each link bearing a designation of the concept it connects to. It can be concluded that coherence is not a mere feature of text, but rather the outcome of cognitive processes and inferences made by the text users. But reading a text is far more complex than creating links across sentence boundaries and pairing and chaining together items that are interrelated by referring to the same entity in the text. Cohesion is only a guide to coherence, and coherence is something created by the reader in the act of reading of the text. Coherence is the feeling that a text hangs together, that it makes sense, and that it is not just a jumble of sentences. Coherence is achieved through grammatical and lexical means of cohesion, as well as presuppositions and logical implications connected to general world knowledge. We already know from the previous lectures that coherence is achieved first of all through coreference, that is the relationship between lingual signs designating the same entity in the world of the text. The most frequently used coreferential devices are looking backward, that's anaphoric reference, which is the most common type of reference used subconsciously in everyday conversation and writing. It occurs when the writer refers back to someone or something that has been previously identified in order to avoid repetition and be more compact. Looking forward, that's cataphoric reference, which is the reverse of anaphoric reference and is relatively straightforward. It occurs when the reader is introduced to someone or something as an abstract entity until it's identified by a coreferring reference expression later. We have already pointed out that cataphoric reference is less common than anaphoric, but in written text it can be used for dramatic or stylistic effect as well as for such pragmatic purpose of the writer as to intensify the reader's interest, stimulating him or her to get the necessary information for filling up the gap created by the prophet. The third coreferential device is looking outward, that's exophoric reference, which is a reference to assumed shelled worlds outside the text. It is used either to describe generic or abstract situations when the writer chooses not to identify a person or a thing, but instead to refer to them as abstract entities, or to identify the referent which is not in the immediate context, but is assumed by the speaker or the writer to be part of a shared world. Co-referential items in English include personal pronouns he, she, it, they, demonstrative this, that, these, those, the definite article, and items like such as, etc. Ellipsis is another device of cohesion, implying the omission of elements in the surface structure of a sentence which the writer or the speaker assumes are obvious from the context and therefore need not be raised. This is not to say that every utterance which is not fully explicit is elliptical. Most messages require some input from the context to make sense of them. Substitution is similar to ellipsis in the fact it has only text. It occurs when, instead of leaving a word or phrase out, as in ellipsis, it is substituted for another, more general word known as proform. Like ellipsis, substitution operates either at nominal, verbal, or clausal level. We have focused on the fact that both ellipsis and substitution assume a lot from the context. They proceed on the basis that omitted and substituted elements are easily recoverable and therefore natural in speech situations where a high degree of contextual support is available. Conjunctions are among those linguistic devices that make grammatical contributions to textuality, creating its cohesion and coherence. A conjunction does not set off or assert backward or forward for its referent, but it does presuppose a textual sequence and signals a relationship between its segments. Lexical cohesion is basically created by reiteration, that means either restating an item in a later part of the text by direct repetition of the word, which is also called lexical recurrence, or by reasserting its meaning through hyponymy, which is based on hyper-hyponymic relations between words, hyperonym being a genus word denoting some class of things, while hyponym represents a particular species of the given class. Synonymy and antonymy, when semantically related pairs of words, belong to the same part of speech, whereas words representing different parts of speech can be linked thematically within a textual segment by the principle of isotopy, that is, through semantically interrelated chains of words. But coherence is not always created through cohesion. That's surface linguistic means of connectivity of text. The act of text interpretation is a set of procedures involving the reader's attempt to adequately decode the information put into the text by its author. It emphasizes the reader's mental activities to build the world of the text, which is based on his or her background knowledge of the world in general, and to observe how things and events are characteristically manifested in it. The reader has to make inferences and disclose those logical implications that underlie different logical relationships between clauses, sentences, and textual segments. Within the text, lingual units of different levels can be logically interconnected through relationships such as phenomenon reason, phenomenon example, cause, consequent, instrument achievement, problem solution, etc. that can be brought under the general heading of logical sequence relations. For example, McCarthy gives an example of a phenomenon example logical relationship which is manifested between the segments consisting of more than one sentence in the passage given below, where the first sentence introduces a definite phenomenon into the initial segment of the text, while the following sentences representing the second segment have to be read as part of the act of exemplification for the whole text in order to make sense. For instance, naturally, the more people pay for their houses, the more they want to rename their neighborhoods. Suppose you have just cut up a great sum of money for an unspectacular house on the fringe of Highgate, an area with loads of cachet. The estate agent tells you it's Highgate. You have paid a Highgate price. There is no way you are going to admit that it is in Crouch End. Another type of logical relationship between textual segments is that of a problem-solution sequence which is adequately marked lexically as it is seen in this extract from the newspaper material borrowed from McCarthy. Week by week, the amount of car traffic on our roads grows 13% in the last year only. Each year, as I walk to work, I see the ludicrous spectacle of hundreds of commuters sitting alone in 4- or 5-seater cars and barely moving as fast as I can walk. Our traffic crisis now presents us with the classic conservation dilemma. Too many people making too much demand on inadequate resources. There are 4 possible solutions. 1. Provide more resources. In the case, build more roads and car parks. 2. Restrict the availability of motorized transport by artificially raising the price of vehicles and fuel. 3. License only those with a good reason for needing motorized transport and prohibit unnecessary ones. 4. Reduce the average size of motor vehicles, especially those used for commuting purposes. When segments of the text are compared or contrasted with one another, then we may talk of matching relations which are extremely common and are mostly supported by syntactic parallelism, as in this example from the Sunday Times magazine. Let's read the text. In Britain, the power of the unions added an extra dread which made British politics a special case. On the continent, Margaret Thatcher was regarded as something of a laboratory experiment, rather like a canary put down to a mineshaft to see if it will sink. In this example, a cause-consequence relation exists between the first 2 segments, with subordination which made as supporting evidence. The first 2 segments taken together then become a single larger segment which stands in a matching relation of contrast with the rest of the extract, which is signaled by the syntactic parallelism in Britain and on the continent. Logical sequencing and matching are the 2 basic categories of the close relation approach between textual segments. This view of text is dynamic. It is not just concerned with labeling what are sometimes called illocutionary acts which individual clauses, sentences, and paragraphs perform in a text, but it is concerned with the relationships the textual segment enter into with one another. It would be wrong to suggest that the whole process of reading is some sort of perverse guessing game for readers. Texts often contain signals how we should understand the relations between its segments. These signals are not absolute clues to make conclusions, they are more supporting evidence to the cognitive activity of deducing relations. For instance, we may find in a text a sentence such as, "Feeling ill, he went home," where the subordination of one element to another by the grammatical choice of joining a main clause to a subordinate one is a characteristic device of cause-consequence relations. If we consider a simple text like the following, we can see a pattern emerging which is frequently found in texts in a wide variety of subject areas and contexts. Let's read the text. Most people like to take a camera with them when they travel abroad, but all airports nowadays have X-ray security screening, and X-rays can damage film. One solution to this problem is to purchase a specially designed lead-lined pouch. These are cheap and protect film from all but the strongest X-rays. The first sentence presents us with a situation, and the second sentence with some sort of complication or problem. The third sentence describes a solution to the problem, and the final sentence gives a positive evaluation of the solution. Such a logical sequence of relations, as McCarthy indicates, forms a situation, problem, solution, evaluation pattern which is extremely common in texts. These larger logical patterns, which may constitute the coherence of whole text, are the objects of interpretation by the reader. They are often signaled by the same sort of the grammatical and lexical devices. In the above example, for instance, a contrasting idea which creates a problem is introduced with the help of the conjunction but, indicating an adversative relation, whereas backward lexical relation to the phrase "the damage caused by X-rays" is carried out with the help of the noun phrase "this problem," and a forward reference to the solution with the noun phrase "a lead-lined pouch," which is referred to anaphorically by a demonstrative pronoun "these" in the final evaluative sentence. Both writers and the readers need to be aware of these signaling devices and use them when necessary to process textual relations that are not immediately obvious. Such knowledge will assist the reader in the act of interpretation. So, finding logical semantic patterns in text is a matter of interpretation by the reader, making use of clues and signals provided by the author, though it is not a question of finding one single right interpretation. Very often it's possible to analyze a given text in more than one way. But certain patterns do tend to occur frequently in particular settings, that is, functional types of text. For instance, the problem-solution pattern is frequent in advertising texts that are aimed at selling a product by convincing people they have a problem they may not be aware of and offering them a certain product as a solution of the problem. We have the similar use of the problem solution patterns in text reporting technological advances, which are often seen as solving problems or removing obstacles, as it is shown in the text about lead-lined pouches designed for carrying cameras. General specific patterns of logical relations can be found in encyclopedias and other reference texts. Claim-counterclaim texts are frequent in political journalism as well as in the letters to editor pages of newspapers and magazines. In the example given below, the reader can find the claim-counterclaim pattern of the text, which is semantically organized in the way that reflects the logical relationships of making claim, counterclaim, evidence of counterclaim, and alternative ways of tackling the issue. Let's read the text. All Western countries face a crisis in coping with demands made on welfare provision by their growing elderly populations. The problem of resource scarcity is a real one, but perhaps not all countries have adopted so rigorously as Britain the view that care should be based on the family model. Scandinavia, for example, provides residential facilities for elderly people not wishing to remain at home or live with their families, and those facilities are often available for use by local pensioners on a daily basis. Elderly people in the USA have developed communities of their own, supporting each other and running them by themselves as their answer to increasing dependency. Some have argued against these age-dense solutions, likening them to ghettos, but research suggests a high degree of consumer satisfaction. These examples from other countries clearly demonstrate that there are alternative ways of tackling the issues of caring and dependency, and that the family model of care, with the demands made on women and the lack of choice and frequent loneliness for the dependents, is not the only solution. We can see that a number of vocabulary items characteristically cluster around the elements of larger patterns in texts. These words stand in place of segments of texts. In linguistic literature, they are called discourse or text organizing words, since it is their function to organize and structure the text. Summing up the lecture, we can conclude that coherence, which implies connectivity of underlying meaning of a text, a continuity of senses, the feeling that a text hangs together, that it makes sense, and that it is not just a jumble of sentences, is not a mere textual feature, but rather the outcome of cognitive processes and inferences made by text users. It is the outcome of the interpretation process, which is dynamic cognitive act on the part of the reader, who is supposed to be asking questions as the text unfolds, to be building textual world on the basis of his or her background knowledge of the world in general, and behavior, how states and events are manifested in it. So we finish the lecture again with the list of references. Thank you for attention.